Well, my name is Daniel Fievez, and grew up in Richland, Washington. Came there in 1943 and graduated from high school in 1958 and left town. My father was born in Belgium and escaped just before the First World War. My mother was born up north of Spokane in a little town called Blue Creek up by Chewelah, Washington. And they both met at Seattle Pacific College over here. And my father died as a result of a house fire in 1942. And then my mother got a job teaching school in Vernita, which is just upstream from Hanford, and then moved to Richland and taught her entire 30 years there. It was a very good, safe place for my mother to be. And there's a lot of, that was of course during the war and just after the war, and there were a number of teachers that were widows, and so the collection of growing up of the people that I knew were primarily widow school teachers and their children, or our church, which was a fundamentalist Free Methodist church, a small congregation there, and that was the social milieu of my experience, other than, in addition to going to Marcus Whitman grade school and Carmichael Junior High, and then of course Columbia High School, the home of the Bombers. The history of those two towns is that they're really quite close together, and when they took Hanford and certainly didn't compensate them as the Constitution says they should, and they took Vernita, but Vernita was like, they all over eastern Washington they call it a town when there's maybe two houses or something. And Vernita, its major asset was that it was a ferry that went across the river. And all I know is that there was a one-room schoolhouse that my mother, in 1943, and when my father died in October of 1942, and so the call came out, and it's just about the time of my research of that period, that the signal was to build Hanford. And so there were still some kids there apparently, because my mother taught all of the grades. She was the only teacher in a one-room schoolhouse. And we lived in what in Seattle you would call a Wallingford bungalow. And it was a farmhouse. It's my first memory of a house, and I can still remember the French doors and some other things about the house. But it was right at the base of Rattlesnake Mountain, and named quite well. And so they had already built, I believe, Priest Rapids Dam. And Priest Rapids Dam, upstream from Hanford, it was a dam that was kind of a low dam that they just backed up the water so that they could put it in irrigation ditches, and the irrigation ditches flowed higher than where the town of Vernita was, which was kind of in the floodplain. And both Vernita, not both, all three, Vernita, Richland, Hanford and Richland were orchard towns, just very, very rich orchards. And so the house that we lived in had orchards. And that summer, conscientious objectors were brought out to harvest that season before they knew what they were going to do with the rest of what they were going to do with the farm, or whether they were going to tear it down or whatever they were going to do. And conscientious objectors, of course, were people who for their religious conscience or what have you, selected, just said, we're not going to go to war and do with us what you want. And it was similar to the Japanese internment. They just put them in internment camps. I have a very good friend that wound up in an internment camp for the entire period of the war. And, they were Conchis. And the people that I met, of course, this is also my first experience. I'm three and change. And it's kind of my first experiences, but I'd come home from school and there would be rattlesnakes, dead rattlesnakes nailed up, drying out, I guess, to the rafters of the woodshed, and this bunch of guys working, harvesting stuff and treating me like I was, the king of the world. So that was my experience with them, and that's who that group of people were. It's a really interesting time, and the place I'd like to refer you to is to Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, No Ordinary Time, in which she explains better than I can about how that all over America people were transferred and transformed into a new America from the places that they've been to, particularly into the West. That if you deal with Hanford specifically, it's more intense, I think, even than other war plants, but not that much different. And people came from all over America to build that Hanford plant, and they built that thing. I just as a person who has spent much of my adult life in building and rebuilding property, it's stunning how fast that they built the entire plant to build the atomic bomb. I mean, like in 2.5 years. And the entire town, and how they organized that while the war movement was going on, while they're building weapons all over, airplanes and tanks and all of the other paraphernalia you need for a war, that they brought that together. I think that one of the tragedies is that the good news part of that was that they hired, that they brought in a lot of the Negro people to work on the place, because Negroes were not really welcome in the military at the first part of the war, and so here was this available workforce who came in, and as soon as the project was over, they just got they got their pink slip and gone. And I consider that one of the real inadequacies of our government, that they treated that group of people that badly. Parenthetically, they moved to, many of them moved to across the railroad tracks in Pasco, which became East Pasco, which became, essentially rather a slum because of the way that we, the white people, treated them. But the town itself, as I think we all recognize, was a government town, and there was, if you didn't work for either the area or, like my mother, worked for a school, there wasn't a job there. And so I can remember these kids being bussed in from West Richland, which was a place upstream on the Yakima River and across the river, and at the bottom of quite a steep hill, and there was a flat spot there that they built a town on. I can remember more clearly going out there during high school, dating a couple of gals that lived out there, that their whole the structure of their housing and everything was so much different than this nicely built, organized city of Richland. And that was where there was one of the drive-in theaters out there, which was a big draw for us teenagers. And there was another one just north of town near North Richland. And you know, that was kind of a disparity. Richland was also a very big orchard community. They destroyed some orchards to build our house, and the Carmichael Junior High School was named after the orchardist. And there are, right past our house was one of these irrigation ditches. It was the irrigation ditch that ran past Vernita. And so it ran all the way there and then dumped back into I believe into the Yakima River just before the confluence into the Columbia. The town was so well organized that it was in ranks, that we lived in a 2-bedroom prefab, which is 28 feet by 28 feet, and they just prefabricated. It came from somewhere else. I have no idea where this thing was built. Never did discover whether they were built close by or brought in on a train, or how they were brought in. But they were just row after row of them. The guys would walk down the street and put up the floor, put up the side, put up the roof, and it had a flat roof, and every once in a while the roof would sail off into the street in a windstorm. I don't know what everybody else had to pay, but it was a government town and you paid rent. Yeah. We paid $25 a month, and if you threw a rock through the window, they came out and fixed it. I mean, they were the landlords, and they took perfect care of us, and that was the heat and the sewer and the lights and everything. You know, when we're growing up, we don't have any comparison to that. And so I really have a difficult time understanding anybody else's lifestyle. The good news of all of that was it was a very cleanly run city. All of the municipality was very, very well taken care of. They had, because of the security, they had an overabundance of police officers. But, you know, unlike what I've watched here in Seattle or other places, you know, they were enormously friendly. At least to me, they were. My teenage years had a bit of interaction with the police officers, and it was. I have a lot of respect looking back at them for one time, a police officer taking me home when I was drunk instead of hauling me downtown, and me opening the door, and my mother's there in a prayer meeting, and introducing the police officer to my mother. I'd like to meet a friend of mine. It didn't go well, I think. But, you know, I was able to do almost anything I wanted. Mm-hmm. There was a total freedom that I don't see now at all. I mean, people are afraid for their children to walk up to the corner for the bus stop or something. And, you know, we roamed all over the place, and throughout my youth, and particularly into my teenage years. And my mother bought 3 horses, one for my brother, one for her, and one for myself. And I would literally, I rode bareback all of the time. And I would literally put a pack on myself with some food and take off for a couple of days. You know, there was no crime, except for, you know, what us kids got into. I got into a couple, 2 or 3 things that they were sort of minor sort of stuff when you look around at it, but there wasn't any fear in the town. There wasn't any, you can't go here, you can't go there, as I see so much of, I hear so much of that. Not so much in Seattle, but I hear about it so much elsewhere. So it was an awfully safe place. Mm-hmm.